You think the worst pain is being betrayed. It's not. The real agony is lying next to someone you love while feeling them slowly disappear in front of you. It's sensing distance where there used to be warmth, silence where there used to be laughter, and questioning your own instincts because you desperately want to believe everything is fine. Many men convince themselves her coldness is just stress, exhaustion, hormones, or routine. But deep down, something feels different, and that feeling slowly eats at you. Because women rarely reveal the truth directly. More often, the truth leaks out through patterns, behavior, energy, and emotional shifts. If you ignore those signals long enough, you don't just lose the relationship. You lose yourself in the process. That's why today we're going deeper than surface level advice. I'm going to walk you through 8 psychological signs that often appear when emotional loyalty has already started slipping away. And some of these signs are subtle enough to fool even intelligent men for years. But once you understand the psychology behind them, you start seeing relationships differently, especially the final sign, because that one changes everything. And before we dive in, I want you to pause for a second and be honest with yourself. Have you ever ignored a red flag because you were afraid of the answer? Have you ever felt your gut screaming at you while your mind tried to silence it? If you have, you're not alone. Thousands of men go through this exact confusion every day, quietly questioning themselves while pretending everything is okay on the outside. So I want you to comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you've ever experienced that painful feeling of emotional distance in a relationship. Your story might help someone else feel less alone tonight. And if this conversation resonates with you, subscribe and like the video because these discussions matter more than people realize. I'm Sarah, host of What She Thinks YouTube channel, and I need you to understand something important before we continue. This video is not about turning you into a paranoid man who suspects every woman of betrayal. That mindset destroys relationships just as fast as dishonesty does. This is about emotional awareness. It's about understanding human behavior deeply enough to recognize when something important has changed. Healthy relationships survive honesty. They survive communication. What they do not survive is prolonged denial. The first sign is one of the quietest and most devastating shifts a man can experience: the cold silence of her body. There's a kind of emotional language that exists beyond words. Long before couples stop saying, "I love you," the body often speaks first. You notice it in the way she hugs you, in the way she kisses you, in the way her energy responds when you walk into the room. Think about the beginning of a relationship. Attraction has movement, curiosity, presence. Even small touches feel alive. A woman who emotionally desires you naturally gravitates toward connection. She leans in, she notices you, her body relaxes around you. But when emotional attachment begins fading, the body changes before the words do. Suddenly, affection becomes mechanical. You hug her and feel tension instead of softness. You reach for her hand and she responds half a second too late. You kiss her and something feels emotionally absent. Not dramatic, just disconnected. And this is where many men begin betraying themselves psychologically. Instead of trusting what they feel, they rationalize it away. She's just tired. She's stressed from work. She's overwhelmed lately. Now listen carefully. Sometimes those explanations are true. Life does affect intimacy. Stress affects emotional availability. But psychologically, patterns matter more than isolated moments. When disconnection becomes consistent, your nervous system notices before your conscious mind does. That's why you feel anxious around someone who used to feel emotionally safe. Your body senses emotional withdrawal even when your brain tries to deny it. There was a man once who shared a story during a relationship workshop. He said the moment he knew something was wrong wasn't when he found messages or noticed lies. It was one random Tuesday night when he hugged his wife from behind while she was cooking. She froze. Not dramatically, just enough for him to feel it. He said, "Her body reacted like I was a stranger." That moment haunted him more than any argument ever could. Because emotional intimacy isn't built on grand gestures, it's built on unconscious comfort. And women often emotionally disconnect internally long before they physically leave externally. So what do you do if you notice this shift? You don't panic. You don't accuse. And most importantly, you don't beg for affection. One of the biggest mistakes men make is responding to emotional distance with emotional chasing. They increase attention, overgive, overtext, overexplain, overperform. But desperation rarely restores attraction. In psychology, anxious pursuit often creates more emotional withdrawal. Instead, slow down and observe calmly. Ask yourself, is this temporary stress or a long-term pattern? Does she reconnect naturally when pressure disappears? Or does the emotional gap continue growing no matter how patient you are? Those questions matter, because awareness protects dignity, and dignity matters more than forced closeness ever will. Now here's where things become even more psychologically revealing. Once emotional disconnection begins internally, behavior patterns often start changing externally too. And that leads directly into the second sign, the sudden shift in routines and appearance. Human beings are creatures of patterns. Especially in long-term relationships, we develop routines without even realizing it. The same habits, the same timing, the same emotional rhythms. That's why sudden, unexplained changes deserve attention. Maybe she suddenly becomes extremely protective of her phone. Maybe she changes her appearance dramatically, without involving you emotionally in the process. New perfume, different style, more secrecy around where she's going, longer preparation times before leaving the house. Again, none of these things automatically mean betrayal. Healthy people evolve, people reinvent themselves, confidence changes appearance. But psychology teaches us to look for clusters of behavior, not isolated details. A woman emotionally investing elsewhere often becomes hyper-aware of presentation. Why? Because attraction activates self-consciousness. Human beings naturally put more effort into how they look when emotional excitement enters their life again. There's actually fascinating research on this. Studies in relationship psychology show that novelty and emotional stimulation increase dopamine activity, which often changes motivation, grooming habits, and emotional energy levels. In simple terms, people behave differently when emotionally energized by someone new. And yes, that can happen innocently. But when combined with emotional distance from you, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. One woman once admitted during a podcast interview that the biggest sign her relationship was emotionally over happened months before the breakup. She said, "I cared more about getting ready for work than I cared about coming home." That sentence hit hard because it revealed something deeper than appearance. Attention follows emotional investment. So if you notice dramatic shifts, don't immediately accuse her of cheating. That approach usually destroys communication completely. Instead, become emotionally observant. Notice, does she still emotionally include you in her world? Does she still seek emotional connection with you? Or does her energy seem increasingly directed outward while your relationship receives leftovers? That distinction changes everything. And let's talk honestly about intuition for a second, because this part matters. Many men are taught to distrust emotional intelligence. They're told noticing subtle emotional changes makes them insecure or weak. So they suppress their instincts until reality becomes impossible to ignore. But emotional awareness is not weakness. Paranoia invents problems. Awareness recognizes patterns. There's a difference. The third sign is where guilt often begins revealing itself emotionally. Unexplained irritation and criticism. This is one of the most misunderstood psychological behaviors in struggling relationships. When people carry internal guilt, they often unconsciously externalize discomfort. In other words, instead of confronting their own emotional conflict directly, they redirect negative energy toward their partner. Suddenly, everything you do becomes irritating. The way you chew, the way you talk, the way you breathe, the way you exist. Small disagreements become emotionally loaded. Now here's why this happens psychologically. Human beings need internal justification for behavior that conflicts with their identity. If someone sees themselves as a good person, but they're emotionally betraying a relationship, cognitive dissonance appears. That internal discomfort creates pressure. And one way people reduce that pressure is by mentally reframing their partner as flawed, inadequate, or emotionally responsible for the distance. It's easier to justify emotional betrayal if the relationship feels emotionally broken in their mind. So arguments increase, criticism increases, patience disappears. And many men respond by desperately trying to prove their worth. They become more accommodating, more apologetic, more careful. But constantly defending yourself inside a relationship slowly destroys self-respect. There's an important difference between accountability and emotional scapegoating. Healthy couples address issues together. Emotionally detached partners often create conflict to emotionally distance themselves further. I remember hearing a therapist explain it this way. Sometimes people pick fights because anger feels easier than guilt. That sentence explains so much relationship behavior. Now let me give you something practical here because awareness without action changes nothing. The next time unnecessary criticism appears, don't immediately react emotionally. Instead, regulate yourself first. Pause, breathe, and calmly observe the emotional pattern underneath the words. Ask yourself, is this conversation actually about the issue being discussed? Or does it feel emotionally displaced? That one question can completely change your perspective. And please understand this clearly. You should never tolerate emotional disrespect simply because you fear losing someone. Fear-based attachment traps people in emotionally unhealthy dynamics for years. A strong relationship requires honesty, not emotional walking on eggshells. Now here's where the situation becomes even more emotionally confusing for many men. Because not every emotionally disconnected woman becomes cold. Some become unexpectedly affectionate instead. And that contradiction confuses people deeply. That's exactly where we're going next. The fourth sign is one of the most emotionally confusing experiences a man can go through: sudden excessive affection. And at first glance, this sounds backwards, doesn't it? Because most people assume emotional betrayal always creates distance, coldness, detachment, silence. But psychology is rarely that simple. Sometimes guilt creates the opposite reaction. A woman who feels emotionally conflicted may suddenly become unusually affectionate, more attentive, more complimentary, more physically present than she has been in months. And if you've been starving emotionally inside the relationship, this sudden warmth feels intoxicating. You think, maybe things are getting better. But sometimes what you're experiencing isn't renewed love, it's emotional compensation. There's an important psychological principle here. Human beings naturally seek emotional balance when guilt becomes overwhelming. When someone feels they've violated their own values, they often unconsciously attempt to repair their self-image through increased kindness or attention. In simple terms, they overcorrect emotionally to reduce inner discomfort. That's why some people become unusually generous after lying, unusually loving after betrayal, unusually attentive after emotional withdrawal. Not always consciously, but psychologically, it happens all the time. There was a woman who once described this experience during a relationship interview. She said, "The guilt made me overly affectionate because I needed reassurance that I was still a good person." Think about how emotionally complicated that is. The affection looked real externally, but internally, it was tied to guilt management, not authentic connection. Now let's be fair and emotionally mature here. Not every wave of affection is manipulation. People reconnect emotionally all the time. The real question is consistency. Does the affection feel grounded and emotionally present? Or does it arrive suddenly after unexplained absences, emotional distance, or suspicious behavior? Does it feel natural? Or does it feel performative? Your nervous system often knows the difference before your mind does. And this is why self-awareness matters so much in relationships. Many men become so emotionally deprived that they accept any form of affection without questioning its emotional source. They confuse relief with intimacy. But genuine intimacy feels emotionally safe, not emotionally confusing. So what should you do if this happens? Don't immediately reject affection. Don't become cold or defensive, but don't abandon awareness either. Stay emotionally grounded enough to ask, does this warmth align with the overall reality of our relationship? Because isolated moments mean very little without emotional consistency behind them. And please hear this carefully. Love is not measured by temporary emotional intensity. It's measured by emotional reliability. That distinction alone could save people years of confusion. Now, the next sign is subtle, painful, and often impossible to explain logically to someone who hasn't experienced it personally. Emotional absence during intimacy. This is where many men finally realize something deeper is wrong, even if they can't fully articulate it. Because intimacy is not just physical contact. Real intimacy contains emotional presence, eye contact, attention, energy, connection, mutual emotional engagement. When those things disappear, physical closeness starts feeling strangely lonely. And loneliness beside someone you love is one of the most painful emotional experiences imaginable. Maybe she still participates physically. Maybe everything technically looks normal. But emotionally, she feels somewhere else. Her energy feels disconnected, distracted, absent. And this creates emotional confusion because the body is present while the emotional connection is missing. One man once explained it perfectly. He said, "It felt like she was acting in a scene instead of sharing a moment with me." That sentence captures the emotional emptiness many people struggle to describe. Now again, let's stay psychologically balanced here. Stress, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, hormonal changes, and emotional burnout can absolutely affect intimacy. Real life impacts emotional connection, but prolonged emotional absence without communication creates deep relational fractures. And many people make the mistake of ignoring those fractures because acknowledging them feels terrifying. Why? Because once you admit the emotional connection is fading, you're forced to confront difficult questions. Can this relationship be repaired? Is this temporary? Or are we emotionally holding on to something that already ended internally? Those are painful questions, but avoiding painful truth usually creates deeper suffering later. Here's what emotionally mature people do differently. Instead of pretending everything is fine, they create honest conversations. Not accusations, not interrogations, not emotional explosions. Honest conversations. "I feel emotional distance between us lately. I miss feeling connected to you. Is there something happening emotionally that we need to talk about?" Those conversations require courage. But emotionally healthy relationships survive difficult honesty far better than silent resentment. And if someone consistently avoids emotional transparency while the distance continues growing, that itself becomes important information. Because healthy love requires participation from both people, not one person desperately trying to keep the connection alive while the other emotionally checks out. Now, the sixth sign often appears outside the home before people fully recognize what's happening emotionally inside the relationship. The increasing emotional importance of outside life. This one is fascinating psychologically. When emotional investment shifts away from a relationship, external environments often become emotionally charged. Work suddenly becomes exciting. Friends become the emotional priority. Social outings become more frequent. Time away becomes emotionally energizing. Coming home feels emotionally flat. Again, this doesn't automatically mean betrayal. People absolutely need independence, friendships, ambition, and personal space. Healthy relationships encourage individuality. But there's a difference between healthy independence and emotional escape. And emotionally detached partners often begin treating home like an obligation instead of a sanctuary. You feel it in the energy. She seems lighter outside the relationship than inside it, more alive elsewhere than with you, more emotionally available to strangers than to the person sharing her life. And that imbalance hurts deeply because emotional neglect often feels invisible. There's no dramatic moment, no obvious explosion, just a slow emotional drifting apart. One woman described her emotional affair this way: "I started feeling more emotionally understood by people outside my relationship than by the man sitting next to me every night." Now, whether that emotional shift was justified or not isn't the point. The point is this: emotional distance rarely appears overnight. It grows gradually through disconnection, avoidance, unresolved resentment, lack of communication, emotional complacency, and unmet needs that nobody addresses honestly. That's why awareness matters early. Not so you can accuse someone, but so you can either repair the connection or stop abandoning yourself trying to save something one-sided. And let me say something important here because many viewers need to hear this. You cannot force someone to emotionally choose you. You can communicate, you can improve, you can listen, you can grow, but you cannot carry an entire relationship alone. At some point, mutual effort becomes non-negotiable. And emotionally mature people recognize that earlier instead of sacrificing years trying to earn basic emotional reciprocity. Now, the seventh sign is one people often dismiss until the pattern becomes undeniable: the collapse of consistency. Psychology teaches us that deception is emotionally exhausting. Why? Because lies require maintenance. People must remember details, manage timelines, control emotional reactions, maintain behavioral consistency, and over time, emotional strain creates cracks. Stories stop aligning, explanations change, details become inconsistent. But here's the mistake many people make. They become obsessed with catching someone in a lie instead of paying attention to the overall emotional reality. You don't need a courtroom-level case to recognize relational instability. Patterns tell stories. Repeated secrecy tells stories. Emotional inconsistency tells stories. Behavioral contradictions tell stories. And deep down, most people recognize these shifts long before they admit them consciously. There's actually powerful research showing that human beings are surprisingly accurate at detecting emotional incongruence subconsciously. Your brain notices inconsistencies in tone, timing, facial expressions, energy, and behavior, even when your conscious mind hasn't fully processed them yet. That's why intuition often feels physical. Your nervous system is gathering information before your thoughts organize it into clarity. Now, this is where self-respect becomes critical. Some people spend years begging for explanations from emotionally unavailable partners. They chase clarity from people actively avoiding transparency, and that pursuit slowly destroys emotional confidence. Healthy relationships should not require constant emotional detective work. Yes, communication takes effort. Yes, misunderstandings happen, but emotional safety should not feel impossible. At some point, you must ask yourself, am I trying to understand someone, or am I trying to convince myself not to see reality? That question changes lives. And finally, the eighth sign, the loss of emotional peace within yourself. This is the sign almost nobody talks about, because sometimes the biggest clue isn't her behavior. It's what the relationship is slowly doing to you. You become anxious constantly, hyper-aware, emotionally exhausted, mentally consumed, always analyzing, always questioning, always trying to decode emotional shifts, and eventually you stop recognizing yourself. That's what unresolved emotional instability does to people. Now let me clarify something very important. Feeling anxious does not automatically mean your partner is betraying you. Anxiety can come from personal insecurity, past trauma, attachment wounds, or fear of abandonment. But emotionally unhealthy relationships absolutely intensify those feelings. A healthy relationship should bring more emotional stability into your life over time, not constant psychological chaos. One therapist said something incredibly powerful. The right relationship calms your nervous system. The wrong one keeps it in survival mode. Read that again mentally. Because many people mistake emotional instability for passion. But real love does not require you to abandon your emotional well-being to maintain connection. And this brings us to the deeper message underneath this entire conversation. The point is not becoming paranoid. The point is becoming emotionally honest. If something feels wrong consistently, address it maturely, communicate clearly, observe honestly, listen carefully, pay attention to patterns instead of isolated moments. And most importantly, stop betraying yourself just to avoid uncomfortable truth. Because self-abandonment destroys people slowly. Now, maybe some of you watching this are realizing your relationship simply needs better communication, more emotional effort, more vulnerability, and deeper honesty. And that's good. Relationships can absolutely heal when two emotionally mature people are willing to confront problems together instead of hiding from them. But if you're the only one fighting for connection, while the other person emotionally checks out repeatedly, you must eventually confront reality with courage. Love without respect becomes emotional imprisonment, and no relationship is worth losing your self-worth. So here's what I want you to do after this video ends. Take 10 quiet minutes alone tonight. No distractions, no phone, no noise. And ask yourself honestly, have I been ignoring emotional truths because I'm afraid of what they mean? That question requires bravery, but clarity changes lives. And before you leave, subscribe, like the video, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. And in the comments, tell me this honestly. What's the biggest relationship lesson life has taught you so far? Because sometimes your experience becomes someone else's wake-up call. And remember this above everything else. Healthy love should never force you to lose yourself just to keep someone else.